My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 34 years old. I never imagined that the moment I would fight hardest for my life would be the same moment my sister-in-law would be fighting just as hard to let me die. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room were fading above me, my heartbeat slowing to a distant echo, when I heard Vanessa's voice cut through the chaos with words that would haunt me forever. Don't waste your time. She's not worth the effort. I was flatlining on that gurney, caught somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, but somehow I heard everything. Every word. Every cold calculation. Every reveal of who she truly was beneath the warm smiles and family dinners. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins not in that hospital corridor, but 3 years earlier in Portland, Oregon, where I had built a modest but fulfilling life as a pediatric occupational therapist. I specialized in working with children who had developmental delays and sensory processing disorders, and there was nothing more rewarding than watching a child who struggled to hold a pencil finally write their own name for the first time. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was enough to afford a small craftsman bungalow in the Sellwood neighborhood, a rescue dog named Pepper, and occasional weekend trips to the Oregon coast. My older brother Ethan and I had always been close despite the 4-year age gap. Growing up in Boise, Idaho, we were each other's constants through our parents' bitter divorce when I was 9 and he was 13. Our father had been an alcoholic whose drinking eventually cost him his job, his marriage, and his relationship with his children. Our mother, Diane, worked herself to exhaustion managing a local grocery store while taking night classes to become a pharmacy technician. Ethan stepped into a protective role early, walking me to school, helping with homework, making sure I had lunch money even when it meant he went without. After high school, Ethan joined the Coast Guard, serving for 6 years before transitioning to civilian life. He settled in Seattle and found work as a marine surveyor, inspecting vessels for insurance companies and conducting damage assessments. It was steady work that paid decently, and he seemed content with his bachelor lifestyle of weekend hiking trips and microbrewery tours with friends. We talked every week, visited each other monthly, and maintained the kind of sibling bond that felt unshakable. When Ethan called me one October evening, his voice had an unfamiliar quality, something light and almost giddy that I'd never heard before. "Claire Bear," he said, using his childhood nickname for me. "I met someone. Really met someone." Her name was Vanessa Caldwell, and according to Ethan, she was everything he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. They'd met at a maritime industry conference in Vancouver where Vanessa was representing a luxury yacht manufacturer as their Pacific Northwest sales director. Ethan described her as brilliant, sophisticated, and surprisingly down to earth despite her high-powered career. "When do I get to meet this miracle woman?" I teased, genuinely happy to hear such joy in my brother's voice. "Soon," he promised. "She's got me thinking about things differently, Claire. About the future, about what I want my life to look like. I think this might be it." The speed of their relationship should have been my first warning sign, but I was caught up in Ethan's happiness. Within 2 months, Vanessa had moved into Ethan's apartment in the Queen and neighborhood. By month 4, they were engaged. The whirlwind nature of it all seemed romantic rather than reckless, especially when I finally met Vanessa at their engagement celebration. She was striking in a way that commanded attention without seeming to try. Tall and lean with auburn hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, she had the kind of elegant bone structure that made her look equally at home in business attire or casual wear. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm, and she greeted me with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "Ethan talks about you constantly," she said, her voice smooth and cultured. "The amazing little sister who helps kids find their voice. He's so proud of you." I liked her immediately, or at least I thought I did. Throughout the evening, I watched how she interacted with Ethan, how she touched his arm when making a point, how she laughed at his stories even though she must have heard them before. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, remembering details Ethan had apparently shared about my recent case with a nonverbal autistic boy who had started using sign language. She complimented my vintage dress, a 1950s find from a local consignment shop, and mentioned she loved thrifting too, though I later learned her version of thrifting involved high-end consignment boutiques in downtown Seattle. The wedding took place 6 months after their engagement at a boutique winery in Woodinville. It was tastefully elegant without being ostentatious, about 80 guests, ceremony in the vineyard, reception in the barrel room. I was the maid of honor, wearing a dusty rose dress that Vanessa had chosen with input from her bridesmaids, all polished professional women who worked in tech, finance, and real estate. I felt slightly out of place among them, the only one whose career was measured in children's breakthroughs rather than quarterly earnings. During my maid of honor speech, I talked about how Ethan had always been my protector, my champion, and how I could see that Vanessa brought out a version of him that was even more confident and content. To Ethan, I concluded, raising my glass, you deserve all the happiness in the world. And to Vanessa, thank you for seeing how special my brother is. Welcome to our family. Vanessa's eyes glistened with what I believed were genuine tears. She hugged me tightly after the speech, whispering, "Thank you for sharing him with me. I promised to take good care of him." In those early months of their marriage, everything seemed ideal. They bought a beautiful mid-century modern home in the Magnolia neighborhood with water views and mature landscaping. Vanessa's career was thriving, she'd been promoted to regional sales manager, and Ethan's business was steady. They hosted dinner parties where Vanessa showcased her considerable cooking skills, preparing elaborate meals while making it look effortless. I visited often, sometimes staying the weekend in their guest room, and on the surface, they seemed like the perfect couple. But there were small moments that didn't quite fit. The way Vanessa would gently correct Ethan when he mispronounced a wine varietal or got a historical fact slightly wrong. How she'd laugh and say, "Oh, Ethan," in a tone that could be interpreted as affectionate but somehow felt diminishing. The occasional comment about how Ethan's work clothes were a bit rumpled, or how he really should join the tennis club where several of her colleagues played. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that all couples had their dynamics, that Vanessa was probably just trying to help Ethan navigate her more refined social circles. Then there was the incident with our mother. Diane had been living in Boise on a fixed income. Her health declining after years of stress and hard work had taken their toll. She developed severe arthritis and chronic back problems that made her pharmacy technician work increasingly difficult. Ethan and I had been pooling money to help with her medical bills, a fact I'd mentioned casually during a family dinner at their house. Vanessa's response was measured but pointed. "It's wonderful that you both want to help your mother," she said, refilling her wine glass with practiced precision, "but at some point, adults need to be responsible for their own financial planning. You can't sacrifice your own futures indefinitely." Ethan had looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I felt a flash of defensiveness. "Our mom sacrificed everything for us," I said, keeping my tone even. "She worked 2 jobs for years to keep us fed and housed. Helping her now isn't sacrifice, it's gratitude." Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just worry about Ethan overextending himself. We have our own goals, our own future to think about." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. I started noticing other comments, other moments where Vanessa's worldview revealed itself in small, uncomfortable ways. She expressed surprise that I still drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic. She questioned why I'd chosen occupational therapy over physical therapy, which apparently paid better. She mentioned more than once that Ethan could make significantly more money if he pursued marine surveying for high-end yacht owners exclusively rather than doing insurance work. "You're too talented to be wasting your skills on mundane assessments," she'd tell him. "You should be networking at the yacht club, building relationships with owners who actually value quality work and pay accordingly." I watched my brother, who had always been confident in his capabilities and content with his choices, begin to second-guess himself. The real trouble started about 18 months into their marriage when Ethan mentioned wanting to help our mother more substantially. Her arthritis had progressed to the point where she could no longer work, and she was facing a gap before her disability benefits would kick in. Ethan proposed sending her $2,000 a month for 6 months to bridge the gap and help cover her medications. When he told me about the plan during one of our weekly phone calls, he sounded uncertain in a way that was unlike him. "Vanessa thinks it's too much," he admitted. "She says we should be saving for our future, maybe starting to think about kids. But Mom needs help now, Claire." I can't just leave her struggling. I encouraged him to follow his conscience, to trust his instinct to help our mother. What I didn't know was that this disagreement was creating serious tension in his marriage. Vanessa saw Ethan's commitment to helping Diane as a character flaw, a sign that he prioritized the past over their future. She began making pointed comments about how successful people didn't let family obligations derail their financial goals. She suggested that our mother's situation was the result of poor life choices and that helping her would only enable continued irresponsibility. The arguments escalated until Ethan finally agreed to a compromise. He'd send $1,000 a month for 3 months instead of $2,000 for 6. I supplemented what I could from my own savings, but it meant postponing some repairs on my house and cutting back on other expenses. When Vanessa learned I was also helping our mother, she seemed almost offended. "You're both so enmeshed with your mother," she said during a tense family dinner. "It's not healthy. At some point, you need to establish boundaries and prioritize your own lives." I bit back my initial response and tried to explain calmly. "Our mother isn't asking for help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. We're offering it because we love her and because she gave us everything when we had nothing. That's what family does. Vanessa set down her fork with deliberate precision. "That's a lovely sentiment, Claire, but it's also naive. Family relationships should be reciprocal and healthy. This feels more like guilt and obligation than love." Ethan interjected then, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. "Let's talk about something else. Who wants dessert?" But the damage was done. The philosophical divide between how Vanessa and I viewed family obligations was now clearly defined, and it was wider than the Columbia River. Over the following months, I saw less of Ethan. Our weekly phone calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When we did talk, the conversations felt stilted, like he was choosing his words carefully. I suspected Vanessa was nearby, monitoring, and I hated that I'd started thinking of her as a monitor rather than a sister-in-law. The few times I visited Seattle, the atmosphere in their home felt different, more formal, less welcoming. Vanessa was polite but distant, and Ethan seemed tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Then came the call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was wrapping up a session with a 5-year-old who was working on fine motor skills when my phone rang. It was Ethan, and his voice sounded strange, hollow. "Claire, I need to tell you something. Mom had a stroke." The world tilted. Our mother was only 62, relatively young for a stroke, but the stress, the years of physical labor, the health problems, it all made terrible sense. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask. "Bad," Ethan said quietly. "She's in ICU in Boise. They don't know yet if there's permanent damage. I'm booking a flight for tomorrow morning." I immediately began making arrangements to join him, calling my supervisor to request emergency family leave, booking the first available flight to Boise, throwing clothes into a suitcase while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. When I called Ethan back to coordinate travel plans, Vanessa answered his phone. "Claire, Ethan's on another call with the hospital," she said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "I wanted to catch you before you booked anything. We think it's best if Ethan goes alone initially to assess the situation. There's no need for both of you to drop everything until we know more." The presumption in her words, the "we" that excluded me from decisions about my own mother, sent a spike of anger through me. "Vanessa, this is my mother. I'm not waiting to see how serious it is before I go to her." There was a pause, then her tone shifted, becoming slightly harder. "Of course, I understand you're emotional right now. I'm just trying to be practical. Ethan can update you, and then you can decide when it makes sense to travel. Rushing to Boise in a panic isn't going to help your mother." I ended the call and booked my flight anyway, a decision that would later reveal itself as the first crack in Vanessa's carefully constructed facade. But at that moment, all I could think about was getting to my mother, holding her hand, telling her that everything would be okay even if I didn't know if it would be. My mother survived the stroke, but it left her with partial paralysis on her left side and significant speech difficulties. The doctors said recovery would be long and uncertain, requiring intensive physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. She would need help with daily activities, possibly for months, possibly permanently. The financial implications were staggering, but more immediately pressing was the question of care. Diane couldn't return to her small apartment alone. She needed someone with her, at least initially. Ethan and I had a difficult conversation in the ICU waiting room about options. Assisted living facilities, in-home care services, the costs and logistics swirled in my exhausted brain. I could take a leave of absence, I suggested. Bring her to Portland, set up the guest room for her. It's not ideal, but it's something. Ethan looked relieved but conflicted. Claire, you can't put your life on hold. You have work, your house, Pepper. And Mom might need care for a long time. We were still debating options when Vanessa arrived from Seattle. She'd flown in a day later, citing important meetings she couldn't reschedule. She found us in the waiting room, brought expensive coffee from a shop near the airport, and settled in to discuss the situation with the air of someone chairing a business meeting. I've been researching facilities, she announced, pulling out her iPad. There are some excellent rehabilitation centers in the Boise area that accept Medicaid. Once Diane is stabilized, we should start the application process. Ethan and I exchanged glances. Mom won't qualify for Medicaid yet, I explained. She has some savings, not much, but enough to disqualify her until it's spent down. And the facilities that accept Medicaid often have long waiting lists. Vanessa frowned slightly, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. Then she'll need to spend down faster. We can consult with an elder law attorney about strategies. The point is, there are professional solutions to this problem. You two don't need to derail your lives playing caregiver. The casual way she referred to caring for our mother as derailing our lives made my stomach turn. She's not a problem to be solved, I said, trying to keep my voice level. She's our mother. We're not just going to warehouse her somewhere because it's convenient. Vanessa's expression cooled. I'm trying to be helpful, Claire. Emotion is clouding your judgment. There are practical realities here that need to be addressed rationally. Over the next week, as our mother slowly stabilized and began the early stages of rehabilitation, the tension between Vanessa and me intensified. She questioned every decision Ethan and I made, from the rehabilitation facility we chose to the supplemental therapists we wanted to hire. She calculated the costs with a running tally that felt accusatory, pointing out how much Ethan's portion would set them back. We were planning to remodel the kitchen this summer, she mentioned more than once. That's obviously not happening now. Ethan was caught in the middle, torn between his wife and his family obligations. I watched him grow quieter, more withdrawn, the light that had always defined him dimming under the weight of competing loyalties. One night, after Vanessa had returned to Seattle for work, Ethan and I sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at terrible sandwiches and drinking burnt coffee. I don't know what to do, he admitted quietly. Vanessa thinks I'm being manipulated by guilt. She says I'm choosing you and Mom over our marriage, over our future. The pain in his voice broke my heart. Ethan, you're not choosing anyone over anyone. You're being a good son and a good brother. That doesn't diminish you as a husband. He shook his head slowly. She doesn't see it that way. She says families should be self-sufficient, that enabling dependency isn't love. She thinks Mom should have planned better, saved more, been more responsible. I wanted to scream at the injustice of it, at the privilege inherent in Vanessa's worldview, but I kept my voice calm. Mom gave us everything she had. She worked herself into the ground for us. How can helping her now be wrong? Ethan didn't have an answer, and I realized with growing dread that Vanessa's perspective was taking root in him, not because he agreed with it, but because the constant pressure was wearing down his resistance. 2 months later, our mother had progressed enough to leave the rehabilitation facility but still needed significant assistance. The plan Ethan and I had worked out was for her to stay with me in Portland for at least 6 months while she continued therapy. I'd arranged for a leave of absence from work, set up the guest room with accessibility equipment, and coordinated with local therapists. Ethan would contribute financially and visit monthly to give me breaks. When I told Vanessa about the plan during a video call, her reaction was immediate and cold. Absolutely not. You're both making a terrible mistake that you'll regret. Your mother needs professional care in a facility designed for her needs, not a makeshift arrangement in your house. And Ethan cannot afford to subsidize this fantasy. We have financial goals, responsibilities, a life we're trying to build. I felt my patience finally snap. Vanessa, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's happening. Ethan is my brother, and Diane is our mother. This isn't negotiable. Her eyes narrowed on the screen. Everything is negotiable, Claire. And you're being incredibly selfish, manipulating Ethan's guilt to serve your own agenda. You're not a trained medical professional. You're a pediatric therapist playing at being a caregiver because it makes you feel important. The accusation was so unfair, so deliberately cruel, that I couldn't formulate a response. Before I could, she continued. I'm telling you right now, if Ethan goes through with this plan, it will seriously damage our marriage. And when it falls apart, when you realize you're in over your head and your mother isn't getting better fast enough, don't expect us to pick up the pieces. I ended the call shaking with anger and something close to fear. Vanessa wasn't just opposed to helping our mother, she was actively working to prevent it, manipulating Ethan through threats and emotional blackmail. When I called my brother to tell him about the conversation, he sounded defeated. She's really upset, Claire. She thinks we're making a mistake. Maybe we should reconsider, look at other options. The fact that he was wavering, that Vanessa's influence had grown strong enough to make him question his own moral compass, terrified me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. But I moved forward with the plan, and our mother came to Portland in late May. The first weeks were exhausting but rewarding. Diane was frustrated by her limitations but determined to improve. We developed routines, celebrated small victories, found moments of laughter amid the challenges. Ethan visited twice in the first month, helping with household projects and spending time with our mother. But the strain was visible. He looked tired, stressed, and he mentioned that things with Vanessa were difficult. She had stopped speaking to me entirely, refusing to attend any family calls or visits. She'd given Ethan an ultimatum: either our mother found other arrangements by the end of summer, or their marriage was in serious jeopardy. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Vanessa's opposition to helping our mother went far deeper than financial concerns or lifestyle preferences. There was something darker driving her hostility, something that would only reveal itself in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. Something that would bring me to that emergency room, fighting for my life while she fought just as hard to end it. The seeds of that terrible day were already planted, growing in the shadows of family dinners and strained phone calls, waiting for the right moment to bloom into catastrophe. If you're wondering how a family disagreement about eldercare could escalate into a life-or-death situation in an emergency room, trust me, I'm still processing it myself. The path from those early tensions to that terrible moment when my heart stopped beating was more twisted than I ever could have imagined, and the revelations that came with it changed everything. The breaking point came on a sweltering August afternoon when everything converged in the worst possible way. My mother had been living with me for 3 months, and while her progress was slower than we'd hoped, she was improving. She could now walk short distances with a walker, her speech was becoming clearer, and she'd regained some use of her left arm. I had returned to work part-time, arranging my schedule so I was home for her morning routine and evening care, with a home health aide coming for the midday hours. Ethan had been visiting less frequently. The tension with Vanessa had escalated to the point where she'd given him another ultimatum: attend marriage counseling with her or she was filing for divorce. He'd agreed, desperate to save his marriage, and the counseling sessions were happening twice a week in Seattle. From what little he shared with me, the therapist seemed to be reinforcing Vanessa's perspective that Ethan had boundary issues with his family of origin. I found this diagnosis deeply troubling, but I was trying to stay out of their marriage as much as possible while still caring for our mother. That particular August day started ordinarily enough. I'd finished my morning sessions at the clinic, came home to have lunch with my mother, and was planning to catch up on documentation while she napped. The home health aide, a kind woman named Patricia, had left at 2, and the house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and Pepper snoring on his bed in the corner. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop when my phone rang. It was Ethan, and he sounded strange, his voice tight and strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Claire, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come to Seattle this weekend? Vanessa and I want to discuss Mom's situation with you in person." My stomach clenched. What's there to discuss? Mom's doing well here. The arrangement is working. There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background, like he had his hand over the phone. When he came back, his voice was even more strained. "Vanessa has found a really good facility in Boise. It's got excellent reviews, accepts Medicare, and has an opening. We think it's time to transition Mom there so you can get your life back." The presumption in his words, the "we" that had replaced "I," made my hands shake. "Ethan, Mom isn't ready for a facility. She's thriving here. She's comfortable, she's making progress. And I don't need to get my life back. This is my life, taking care of family." More muffled conversation, then Vanessa's voice came on the line, sharp and impatient. "Claire, stop being dramatic. This isn't about what you want. It's about what's best for Diane. She needs professional care in an environment designed for her condition. You're not equipped to provide that long term, and frankly, you're holding her back by playing caregiver instead of letting professionals do their jobs." Every word was calculated to wound, to diminish, to assert her authority over a situation she had no right to control. "Put Ethan back on the phone," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "No," Vanessa replied coolly. "We're presenting a united front on this. Ethan agrees with me that this has gone on long enough. We've already put down a deposit at the facility. Mom will be moving there at the end of the month whether you cooperate or not." The audacity of it took my breath away. "You have no legal authority to make decisions about my mother's care. Neither of you can force this." Vanessa laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "Actually, Ethan has been working with an attorney. As her son and the one contributing the most financially to her care, he is standing to petition for guardianship if you're deemed to be providing inadequate care. And I think we both know that a judge would side with professional facility care over your amateur setup." The threat was clear and terrifying. I knew Ethan would never actually go through with a guardianship petition, but the fact that Vanessa had researched it, had planted the idea, revealed a level of manipulation I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. "Let me speak to my brother," I demanded. "Ethan is done being manipulated by you," Vanessa said, her voice hardening. "He's finally seeing clearly that you've been using guilt and family obligation to control him, to keep him tied to a past that's holding him back. We're moving forward, Claire, with or without your blessing. The facility has been paid for. The arrangements are made. This conversation is just a courtesy to inform you of decisions that have already been finalized." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what had just happened. My brother, the person I'd trusted most in the world, had apparently been convinced to institutionalize our mother against her wishes, because his wife deemed it inconvenient to have family obligations. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced before. I immediately tried calling Ethan back, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried 3 more times with the same result. Then I called my mother's cell phone, intending to warn her about what was happening, but she didn't answer either. She often left her phone in another room or forgot to turn up the volume, so that wasn't unusual, but in that moment, it felt ominous. I decided to check on her directly. I walked down the hallway toward the guest room where she'd been napping, calling out softly so I wouldn't startle her. "Mom? You awake?" There was no response. I pushed open the door and found her lying on the bed, but something was wrong. Her breathing was labored and uneven, her face had a grayish tinge, and when I called her name more urgently, she didn't respond. I rushed to her side, my nurse's training from years of medical conferences kicking in as I checked her pulse. It was rapid and thready, and her skin was cold and clammy. "Mom, can you hear me?" I asked loudly, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. This wasn't sleep. This was something medical, something serious. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I gave the dispatcher my address and described my mother's condition. She's unresponsive, rapid pulse, cold and clammy skin, labored breathing. She had a stroke 3 months ago. I think she might be having another one or possibly a cardiac event. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking questions, giving instructions. I followed them mechanically, checking her airway, monitoring her breathing, keeping track of her pulse. The minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like hours. I heard Pepper barking frantically at the front door, then the sound of heavy footsteps and professional voices. Paramedics filled the small guest room, taking over with practiced efficiency. They asked rapid-fire questions about her medical history, medications, recent symptoms. I answered as best I could while they worked, starting in 4, checking vitals, preparing to transport. "We need to get her to Providence Medical Center immediately," the lead paramedic said. "Ma'am, are you riding with us?" I nodded, grabbing my purse and phone. "I'm her daughter. I'm coming." In the ambulance, I held my mother's hand, watching the paramedics work, listening to the medical jargon that I only half understood. They suspected another stroke or possibly a pulmonary embolism, both terrifying possibilities. I texted Ethan from the ambulance, my fingers clumsy on the screen. "Mom is being rushed to Providence ER. Possible stroke or embolism. Come now." The response came not from Ethan but from Vanessa. "We're in counseling session. We'll call you when we're done." The casual dismissal of a medical emergency was so shocking that I stared at the phone in disbelief. I called Ethan directly, and when it went to voicemail again, I left a message that I hoped conveyed the urgency. "Ethan, Mom is in an ambulance heading to Providence ER. This is serious. Please come now. I need you." At the hospital, everything became a blur of emergency room chaos. My mother was wheeled away immediately, and I was directed to wait in a small consultation room while they stabilized her. A nurse came to get more detailed medical history. A social worker asked about insurance and advanced directives. I provided information mechanically, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. An hour passed, then 2. I called Ethan 4 more times with no answer. I sent increasingly urgent texts. Finally, my phone rang, but it was Vanessa again, not my brother. "Claire, we got your messages. Ethan is very upset. What's the situation?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Where is Ethan? Why isn't he calling me himself?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "He's too emotional to talk right now. He asked me to get the details." "So what exactly happened?" I explained the situation as succinctly as I could, fighting to keep my voice steady. "The doctors are still running tests. It could be another stroke, could be a blood clot. They won't know for sure until they complete imaging. But Mom, I need Ethan here. Mom needs him here." There was a pause, then Vanessa's voice came back cooler and more distant. "We're 3 hours away, Claire. Rushing to the hospital isn't going to change anything. Ethan will come tomorrow after he's had time to process this, and we've made arrangements." The calculated calmness of her response while my mother was fighting for her life was incomprehensible. "Vanessa, this is an emergency. Mom could die. Ethan needs to be here tonight." Another sigh. "You're being hysterical. The doctors are handling it. There's nothing Ethan can do by driving through the night. We'll leave first thing in the morning." She hung up again, and this time, I threw my phone across the small room in frustration. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor, the screen cracking. I retrieved it with shaking hands, but it still worked well enough to make calls. Hours crawled by. A doctor finally came to update me. My mother had suffered a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lung. They'd started her on blood thinners and she was stabilized, but she was still in critical condition. The next 24 hours would be crucial. They were moving her to the ICU, and I could see her once she was settled. When I was finally allowed into her ICU room, my mother looked so small and fragile among the machines and monitors. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand, and the exhaustion of the day finally crashed over me in waves. I must have dozed off in the uncomfortable chair because the next thing I knew, a nurse was gently shaking my shoulder. "Miss Donovan? You've been here for almost 8 hours. You should go home, get some rest, change clothes. Your mother is stable, and will call if anything changes." I resisted at first, not wanting to leave, but the nurse was persuasive. "You can't take care of her if you don't take care of yourself. Go home for a few hours. We have your number." Reluctantly, I agreed. I drove home in the early morning darkness, my body aching and my mind numb. Pepper greeted me frantically at the door, and I realized I hadn't arranged for anyone to take care of him. I let him out, fed him, and collapsed on the couch without even changing clothes. I woke 3 hours later to pounding on my front door. Disoriented and groggy, I stumbled to answer it, expecting maybe a neighbor or the mail carrier. Instead, I found Ethan and Vanessa standing on my porch. Ethan looked haggard and worried, but Vanessa looked immaculate as always, not a hair out of place despite the supposedly rushed journey from Seattle. "How is she?" Ethan asked immediately, pushing past me into the house. "Stable but critical," I replied, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Pulmonary embolism. She's in ICU. I was there all night." Ethan ran his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of stress. "Why didn't you call me sooner? I should have been there." The accusation in his tone sparked my anger back to life. "I did call you. Multiple times. You were in counseling and couldn't be bothered to answer. Vanessa said you'd come in the morning, which I guess means now." Vanessa stepped forward, her expression sympathetic in a way that felt completely artificial. "Claire, you look terrible. Have you slept at all? Maybe you should let Ethan and me handle things from here. You're obviously at your limit." The suggestion that I should step aside now that the real crisis had arrived was so transparently manipulative that I almost laughed. "I'm fine. I'm going back to the hospital. You're welcome to come with me." We drove separately to Providence Medical Center, and the tension in the ICU waiting area was thick enough to cut. A doctor came to update us, explaining that my mother's condition remained serious but stable. They were monitoring her closely for any signs of additional clots or complications. She was sedated to help her body rest and heal. We took turns sitting with her, and during one of my shifts, I noticed Vanessa outside the room talking intently on her phone. She was animated in a way I rarely saw, gesturing emphatically, and though I couldn't hear the conversation, her body language suggested she was arguing with someone. When she finished the call and returned to the waiting area, her expression was carefully neutral again. "Work emergency," she explained when she noticed me watching. "Some people can't handle things without constant supervision." Over the next 2 days, my mother's condition slowly improved. The blood thinners were working, and her oxygen levels were stabilizing. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that she would recover from this setback, though it would add months to her rehabilitation timeline. Throughout this crisis, I noticed a disturbing pattern. Whenever doctors discussed treatment options or next steps, Vanessa would interject with questions about costs, about long-term prognosis, about quality of life. She framed these as practical concerns, but there was something cold in the way she calculated the value of my mother's life against the inconvenience and expense of her care. During one particularly difficult conversation with a social worker about extended care options, Vanessa suggested that we should consider the possibility that aggressive treatment might not be in my mother's best interest. "She's already had one stroke and now this embolism," Vanessa said in her measured, reasonable tone. "At some point, we have to ask ourselves if we're prolonging suffering rather than preserving life. Maybe it's time to consider palliative care options, focus on comfort rather than aggressive intervention." The suggestion, made while my mother was actually showing improvement, was so shockingly inappropriate that even the social worker looked taken aback. "Mrs. Caldwell, your mother-in-law is responding well to treatment. She has every indication of making a substantial recovery from this event. Palliative care would be premature at this stage." Vanessa smiled tightly. "Of course. I'm just thinking long-term. We all want what's best for Diane." But I saw the calculation in her eyes, and something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't about what was best for my mother. This was about removing an obstacle, an inconvenience, a drain on resources that Vanessa felt belonged to her and Ethan. I pulled Ethan aside later that day and confronted him about Vanessa's comments. "Did you hear what she said in there? She was suggesting we give up on Mom, let her die basically, when she's actually getting better." Ethan looked uncomfortable. "She's just trying to be realistic, Claire. We have to think about quality of life, about what Mom would want." The fact that he was defending Vanessa's position terrified me. Mom would want to live. She's been fighting so hard to recover. She's not ready to give up, and neither should we. Ethan nodded but didn't look convinced. Vanessa's been through this with her grandmother. She knows how hard prolonged illness can be on a family. She's trying to spare us from making decisions based on guilt rather than what's truly best. I wanted to scream that Vanessa knew nothing about our family, about our mother, about what was truly best. But I could see that she'd already planted seeds of doubt in Ethan's mind, already reframed the conversation in a way that made continued treatment seem like selfish prolonging of suffering rather than compassionate care for a woman who wanted to live. 3 days after the embolism, my mother was moved from ICU to a regular room. She was conscious, able to speak, and relieved to have survived another health crisis. I spent hours with her, reading to her, helping her eat, encouraging her through the fear and frustration. Ethan visited regularly but always seemed distracted, always checking his phone, always stepping out to take calls from Vanessa who had returned to Seattle for work. Then came the day that would change everything, the day I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times trying to understand if there was something I could have done differently. It was a Wednesday afternoon, sunny and warm outside while the hospital remained artificially cool and sterile. I had left my mother's room to get coffee from the cafeteria, needing a break after several hours at her bedside. I was standing in line, waiting to pay for my overpriced latte, when I felt the first strange flutter in my chest. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as stress or fatigue. But as I walked back toward the elevators, the flutter became more pronounced, my heart seeming to skip beats and then race to catch up. I made it to the elevator and pressed the button for my mother's floor, but the sensation was getting worse. My chest felt tight, my breathing became difficult, and a strange lightheadedness washed over me. I stepped out of the elevator on the wrong floor, disoriented, and tried to orient myself. The hospital corridor stretched in front of me, but my vision was starting to narrow, dark spots appearing at the edges. I reached for the wall to steady myself, but my legs were suddenly unable to support my weight. I heard someone shout, felt hands catching me before I hit the floor, heard the urgent call for a medical team. Then everything became fragments, disconnected moments that didn't quite form a coherent narrative. I was on a gurney, fluorescent lights passing overhead. Voices discussing cardiac arrest, talking about ventricular fibrillation, shouting for a crash cart. I felt the pressure of compressions on my chest, heard the high-pitched whine of a defibrillator charging, and then nothing, just darkness and silence. Except it wasn't complete silence. Somewhere in the void between consciousness and death, I could still hear voices. Distant at first, then gradually becoming clearer. I heard the controlled chaos of emergency resuscitation, the beep of monitors, the calm, urgent instructions of the medical team. I heard someone say my name, ask if anyone knew my medical history, if I had any allergies. Then I heard another voice, one I recognized, one that made something in my fading consciousness recoil with horror. "Don't waste your time." It was Vanessa's voice, clear and cold even through the haze of dying. "She's not worth the effort. Her heart's already failed. She's already gone. Let her go." There was a pause, a moment where the medical team seemed to process what she'd just said. Then another voice, authoritative and firm. "Ma'am, step back. We don't stop resuscitation based on family preference during active intervention." But Vanessa persisted. "I'm her sister-in-law. I know she wouldn't want this. She has no quality of life, no real future. This is mercy, letting her go peacefully." The lie was so audacious, so completely fabricated, that even in my dying state, I felt a surge of outrage. I wanted to scream that I was only 34, that I had every reason to live, that she had no right to speak for me. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but listen as she tried to convince the medical team to abandon their efforts to save my life. "Ma'am, we have protocols. Unless there's a DNR order or clear advance directives, we continue resuscitation. Please step out of the treatment area." I heard footsteps, presumably Vanessa being escorted away, then the medical team resumed their work with renewed intensity. I felt another shock from the defibrillator, felt my body convulse, and then suddenly, miraculously, I felt my heart stutter back to life. The beeping of the monitor became regular, steady, and the darkness began to recede. I heard relieved voices, someone saying, "We've got a pulse, she's back," and the organized chaos of post-resuscitation care. I drifted in and out of consciousness over the next hours, aware of being moved to the cardiac ICU, aware of tests being run, of doctors discussing possible causes for sudden cardiac arrest in an otherwise healthy 34-year-old woman. But through it all, one thought burned with crystal clarity in my mind. Vanessa had tried to let me die. She had stood in that emergency room and tried to convince trained medical professionals to abandon their efforts to save my life, and she had done it with the calculated coldness of someone making a business decision. When I finally regained full consciousness, I found Ethan sitting beside my bed, his face pale and drawn. "Claire, thank God," he whispered when he saw my eyes open. "You scared me so badly. Your heart just stopped. They said if you hadn't already been in the hospital when it happened, you probably wouldn't have made it." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from the intubation tube they'd inserted during resuscitation. Ethan held a cup of water with a straw to my lips, and I took small sips until I could form words. "Where's Vanessa?" I managed to rasp. Ethan looked confused by the question. "She's in the waiting area. She was here when it happened, actually. She'd come to visit your mom and was in the hallway when the medical team rushed to you. She's been really upset." The disconnect between what he was saying and what I knew to be true was staggering. Vanessa wasn't upset about my near-death. She was upset that I'd survived. I wanted to tell Ethan what I'd heard, what his wife had tried to do, but the words stuck in my throat. Would he even believe me? Would he think the cardiac arrest had caused hallucinations or confusion? Before I could decide how to proceed, a doctor entered the room to check on me. She was a cardiologist named Dr. Rashida Patel, and she had kind eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Donovan, you gave us quite a scare. How are you feeling?" I described the sensations as best I could, the chest flutter, the difficulty breathing, the sudden collapse. Dr. Patel nodded, making notes on her tablet. "We've run extensive tests, and we've found the cause. You have a congenital heart condition called long QT syndrome. It's a disorder of the heart's electrical system that can cause rapid, chaotic heartbeats. In your case, it was triggered by stress, exhaustion, and possibly dehydration." She explained that the condition was manageable with medication and lifestyle modifications, but that I'd need to avoid certain triggers and be monitored regularly. "You're very fortunate that this happened in a hospital," she added. "The quick response time is the only reason you're alive. If this had occurred at home or while driving, the outcome would likely have been very different." Ethan gripped my hand tightly, and I saw tears in his eyes. But I was thinking about Vanessa, about how she'd known I was dying in a hospital surrounded by medical professionals who could save me, and she'd still tried to stop them. Over the next day, as I stabilized and began to process what had happened, I replayed that moment in my mind again and again. I needed to know if what I'd heard was real or if it was some kind of oxygen-deprived hallucination. I decided to ask the nurse who'd been present during my resuscitation, a seasoned ICU nurse named Marcus who'd worked in cardiac care for 15 years. When he came to check my vitals, I asked him carefully, during the resuscitation, was there a woman there? Auburn hair, expensive clothes, probably looked out of place. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, becoming guarded. There was a woman who claimed to be family. Why do you ask? I took a breath, trying to keep my voice steady. What did she say? I know this sounds strange, but I think I could hear things while I was out. I need to know if it was real. Marcus hesitated, clearly weighing patient privacy against something else. Finally, he spoke quietly. She tried to stop the resuscitation. Told us you wouldn't want extraordinary measures, that we should let you go peacefully. Dr. Chen had to have security escort her out of the treatment area. The confirmation that what I'd heard was real and not a hallucination sent a chill through me. Did she say why? Did she give any reason? Marcus shook his head. Just that it would be merciful. That you had no quality of life. He paused, then added, "Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but what she did was way out of line. We see family members struggle with these decisions all the time, but you're 34 and otherwise healthy." There was no medical justification for what she was suggesting. It raised red flags for several of us. After Marcus left, I lay in my hospital bed trying to understand. Why would Vanessa want me dead? The most obvious answer was that I was the obstacle to her plan to institutionalize my mother, the person standing between her and complete control over Ethan's family obligations. Without me, Ethan would be the sole decision-maker for our mother's care, and Vanessa had already demonstrated her ability to manipulate his choices. But could someone really be that cold, that calculating? Could she actually be willing to let me die just to gain control? I needed to tell Ethan. He needed to know what his wife had done. But when he returned to my room that evening, Vanessa was with him, and the sight of her standing there wearing an expression of concerned sympathy made my skin crawl. "Claire, we've been so worried," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Thank goodness you're okay. This has been such a terrible ordeal for everyone." I stared at her, this woman who tried to convince medical professionals to let me die, now playing the role of concerned family member. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "Can I talk to Ethan alone?" I asked, not taking my eyes off Vanessa. She smiled, that tight, controlled smile I'd come to recognize as her tell when she was angry but trying to hide it. "Of course. I'll go check on Diane. I'm sure she's worried sick about you." After she left, I turned to my brother and made a decision that would crack open the carefully constructed facade of his marriage and reveal the darkness beneath. "Ethan, I need to tell you something about Vanessa, and I need you to really hear me." Thought I knew about my brother's marriage and about the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. The words came out in a rush, everything I'd been holding back since that terrible moment in the emergency room when I'd heard Vanessa's voice cutting through the chaos with her cold directive to let me die. I told Ethan about hearing her tell the medical team not to waste their time, about her claims that I had no quality of life, about the nurse's confirmation that she'd actively tried to stop my resuscitation. I watched my brother's face as I spoke, watched the disbelief give way to confusion, then to something that looked almost like fear. "That can't be right," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Vanessa was upset when you collapsed. She called for help. Why would she then try to stop them from saving you?" I reached for his hand, squeezing it hard. "I don't know why, Ethan. But I heard her." The nurse confirmed it. "She was escorted out by security because she was interfering with the resuscitation. You can verify this with the medical staff if you don't believe me." He pulled his hand away, running it through his hair in that gesture I knew meant he was overwhelmed. "This doesn't make sense. Vanessa has been nothing but supportive through all of this." The denial was so complete, so absolute, that I felt a surge of desperation. "Has she, Ethan? Really? She's been pushing to institutionalize Mom since the beginning. She's tried to control every decision, questioned every expense, suggested giving up on treatment when Mom was actually improving. And now this. Don't you see a pattern?" He stood up abruptly, pacing the small hospital room. "You're misinterpreting everything because you don't like her. Vanessa has been trying to be practical, to think long-term, to protect our future. That's not the same as wanting people to die." Before I could respond, the door opened and Vanessa herself walked in, her timing so perfect that I wondered if she'd been listening outside. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, her eyes moving between Ethan and me with calculated concern. "Claire was just telling me something disturbing," Ethan said, and I saw Vanessa's posture shift almost imperceptibly, preparing for attack or defense. "She says you tried to stop the medical team from resuscitating her during her cardiac arrest." Vanessa's expression morphed into shocked hurt so convincing that if I hadn't heard her actual words myself, I might have doubted my own memory. What? Ethan, that's insane. I was the one who found her collapsed. I was the one who called for help. How could she possibly think I would try to harm her? She turned to me, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something cold and reptilian. Claire, I know you've been under tremendous stress. The cardiac arrest, the oxygen deprivation, it can cause confusion, false memories. I would never, ever do something like that. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this wasn't the first time she'd manipulated reality to suit her narrative. I'm not confused, I said firmly. Ask the nurse, Marcus. Ask Dr. Chen who had to have you removed from the treatment area. They'll confirm what happened. Vanessa's expression shifted to something that looked like pity. Ethan, maybe we should let her rest. She's clearly not thinking straight right now. But I saw a flash of something else in her face, a calculation, a weighing of options. Ethan looked torn, standing between his wife and his sister, both telling him contradictory versions of reality. I'll talk to the medical staff, he said finally. I need to understand what actually happened. Vanessa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. I have nothing to hide. They'll tell you I was trying to help. After they left, I buzzed for Marcus and asked him to document what had happened during my resuscitation, to put it in my medical records if it wasn't already there. He assured me that any interference with emergency treatment was always documented, and that there was already a note in my chart about a family member being removed from the treatment area for attempting to influence care decisions. The confrontation I'd forced had set something in motion that I couldn't control. Over the next 2 days, as I recovered enough to be moved out of cardiac ICU, the tension in my family reached a breaking point. Ethan did talk to the medical staff and received confirmation that Vanessa had indeed tried to stop my resuscitation. But instead of seeing this as the red flag it obviously was, he seemed to retreat further into justification and denial. She was in shock, he explained when he came to visit alone. She thought you were already gone, that continuing would be cruel. She wasn't thinking clearly. I stared at my brother, this person I'd trusted my entire life, and barely recognized him. Ethan, the medical team told her I still had a chance. They told her to step back. She persisted. That's not shock, that's intention. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I can't believe Vanessa would want to hurt you. There has to be another explanation. The fact that he was choosing to believe an alternative explanation rather than face the obvious truth broke something in me. She wants me out of the way so she can control what happens to Mom. Can't you see that? His face hardened. Not everything is about Mom, Claire. Maybe this is about the fact that Vanessa has never felt fully accepted in this family. Maybe she was lashing out because she feels like an outsider. The twisted logic of blaming Vanessa's attempt to let me die on her feeling excluded would have been laughable if it wasn't so tragic. I realized in that moment that Vanessa's influence over my brother was complete, that she'd managed to reframe even the most egregious behavior as somehow justified or explainable. My mother, when she learned about my cardiac arrest, was devastated and furious. Despite her weakened state, she insisted on being wheeled to my room so she could see me with her own eyes. My baby, she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held my hand. I almost lost you. I told her everything, about Vanessa's actions, about Ethan's refusal to see the truth. My mother's expression turned from grief to something harder, more determined. That woman will not destroy this family, she said with more strength than I'd heard from her in months. I won't let her. But what could any of us do? Vanessa had committed no crime. She'd expressed an opinion during a medical emergency, however inappropriate and cruel. She hadn't physically harmed me. The damage she'd done was emotional, psychological, relational. There was no legal recourse, no clear path to justice. All we could do was survive and try to protect ourselves from further harm. I was discharged from the hospital 5 days after my cardiac arrest with a prescription for beta blockers, strict instructions to avoid stress, and a follow-up appointment with a cardiologist. The irony of being told to avoid stress while dealing with a sister-in-law who tried to let me die was not lost on me. My mother was discharged 2 days later, and we returned to my house to continue her recovery. Ethan helped with the logistics of getting us both home, but the ease between us was gone, replaced by a careful formality that hurt worse than anger would have. Vanessa didn't come to Portland for the discharge. She sent a flower arrangement with a card that read, "Wishing you both a speedy recovery." I threw it in the trash without putting it in water. The weeks that followed were strange and strained. Ethan called regularly to check on our mother but avoided any discussion of Vanessa or what had happened at the hospital. My mother grew stronger, determined to recover as if pure will could protect us from the chaos that had invaded our lives. I returned to work gradually, my colleagues supportive but confused about the family drama they couldn't fully understand. Then came the call that would finally force everything into the open. It was late September, the air turning crisp with the promise of autumn, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Donovan? This is Detective Sarah Martinez with Portland Police. I'm calling regarding an incident that was reported to our department. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" My heart rate spiked, and I had to remind myself to breathe slowly, to not trigger another cardiac event. "What kind of incident?" Detective Martinez's voice was professional but kind. "We received information suggesting that during your recent hospitalization, someone may have attempted to interfere with your medical care in a way that could constitute reckless endangerment. I'd like to ask you some questions if you're willing." It turned out that Marcus, the ICU nurse, had filed a report with the hospital's ethics board about Vanessa's behavior. The ethics board, in turn, had referred the matter to police because they believed Vanessa's actions might cross the line from inappropriate into criminal. I met with Detective Martinez the following day and gave a complete statement about everything that had happened. She listened carefully, took detailed notes, and asked clarifying questions. "This is unusual," she admitted. "Typically family members express opinions about care, and while those opinions can be inappropriate, they don't usually rise to criminal behavior. But in your case, the medical staff's documentation suggests Ms. Caldwell was unusually persistent and specific in trying to stop resuscitation of a patient who had every chance of survival." The investigation moved slowly, as these things do. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ethan deteriorated further. When he learned about the police investigation, he was furious. "You called the police on my wife? On Vanessa?" His voice on the phone was tight with anger. "I didn't call them, Ethan. The hospital did. Because what she did was so far out of bounds that it triggered mandatory reporting." He made a sound of frustration. "This is vindictive, Claire. You're trying to destroy my marriage because you've never liked Vanessa." The accusation was so unfair that I couldn't even formulate a response. Before I could try, he continued. "I'm done, Claire. I can't deal with this anymore. Choose whatever relationship you want with me, but I'm choosing my wife." He hung up, and the silence that followed felt final in a way that hollowed me out. My brother, my childhood protector, my closest ally, was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd chosen his manipulative wife over the truth. The police investigation concluded 2 months later with no charges filed. The district attorney determined that while Vanessa's behavior was deeply troubling and ethically questionable, it didn't meet the legal threshold for criminal interference with medical care. She'd expressed an opinion, however horrible, but she hadn't physically prevented the medical team from doing their jobs. The outcome was disappointing but not surprising. Some kinds of evil operate in spaces where the law can't reach. But the investigation had one unintended consequence. During the process, Detective Martinez had interviewed multiple hospital staff members and reviewed all the documentation from both my cardiac arrest and my mother's treatment. She'd also looked into Vanessa's background more thoroughly than anyone else had. What she found, she shared with me in our final meeting, was illuminating. "Miss Donovan, I want you to be aware of something. Vanessa Caldwell's grandmother, the one she claimed to have cared for through prolonged illness, died under circumstances that raised questions among hospice staff. No formal investigation was conducted, but there were concerns that Ms. Caldwell may have been overly aggressive in pushing for cessation of treatment. The implication hung in the air between us. Vanessa had a pattern, a history of encouraging the death of inconvenient family members. She'd done it before, gotten away with it, and tried to do it again with me. I can't prove anything, Detective Martinez continued, and the grandmother's death was ruled natural causes. But I thought you should know. Armed with this information, I made one final attempt to reach my brother. I called him and asked to meet in person, just the two of us. To my surprise, he agreed. We met at a neutral coffee shop in a suburb between Portland and Seattle, sitting across from each other like strangers negotiating a business deal. I told him everything Detective Martinez had shared, about Vanessa's grandmother, about the pattern of behavior. I watched his face as I spoke, looking for any sign that the brother I knew was still in there somewhere. For a moment, just a moment, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a wall of defensive anger. You're really going to keep pushing this conspiracy theory? Vanessa's grandmother was 93 years old and dying of cancer. Of course Vanessa advocated for comfort care over aggressive treatment. That's compassion, not murder. I leaned forward, desperate to make him understand. Ethan, she tried to let me die. I was 34 and savable, and she tried to convince doctors to stop trying. If she'd do that to me, what do you think she'll do to Mom the next time there's a medical crisis? His expression closed off completely. I think you've convinced yourself of a narrative that makes you the victim and Vanessa the villain because you can't accept that maybe, just maybe, she was trying to help in her own way. He stood up, preparing to leave. I love you, Claire. You're my sister and I always will care about you. But I love my wife too, and I believe her. Until you can accept Vanessa as part of this family, I don't think we can have a relationship. He walked out, and I sat there in the coffee shop watching him go, wondering if I'd ever get my brother back or if Vanessa had won completely. My mother and I settled into a new normal, one without Ethan's presence but with a deeper bond forged through surviving together. She continued to improve, regaining most of her mobility and independence. I managed my heart condition with medication and monitoring. We built a life that was quieter, smaller, but authentic. Sometimes I wonder if Ethan ever doubts his choice, if he ever lies awake at night remembering the brother and sister who used to be inseparable. Sometimes I hope he does. Mostly, though, I focus on moving forward, on the family I still have and the truth I know even if others refuse to see it. Because in the end, survival isn't just about a heart that keeps beating. It's about holding on to your truth even when the people you love most choose comfortable lies instead. It's about protecting the vulnerable even when it costs you everything. And it's about accepting that sometimes the family you're born with isn't the family you end up with, and that's a grief that never fully heals but eventually becomes something you can carry. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.